Black patriarch.
Most American people, especially people of my ethnicity, they don't understand that people create jobs, not government. That people create jobs, not government. That people create jobs, not government. They think, if I go out to get a job, prime example, they have 1,000 jobs at Walgreens offering. You got 500,000 people standing in line. They don't understand, a lot of Americans, including people of my ethnicity, they don't understand that people, since the pop, the mom shops, create jobs.
Productivity is an economic term describing the relationship between outputs as compared to inputs needed to produce those outputs. It's a measure of efficiency. Typical inputs are raw materials, labor, and capital assets. Outputs are generally expressed as either revenue or total units of finished goods. Productivity is measured at every level of the economy, from the total economy as a whole all the way down to the individual level. For the economy as a whole, productivity is calculated by dividing the economy's gross domestic product by the total labor hours it took to produce that GDP.
The country's GDP. This stands for Gross Domestic Product. GDP is a common measure that's used to roughly represent the size of a country's economy. The way you calculate GDP is both simple as a general principle and complicated in the details. The simple version is that GDP is the value of all the goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time, such as a financial quarter or a year. A country with a large growing GDP might look strong on paper, but what if that number is masking a vast income inequality, a productive economy based on huge amounts of low-wage labor? A simple example would be comparing GDP with population to come up with per capita GDP, which means economic value per person. So, according to the World Bank, in 2013, China's GDP was a massive $9.2 trillion. Compare that to Luxembourg's relatively small GDP of $60 billion. Yet, in that same year, China's GDP per capita was only about $6,800, while Luxembourg's was more than 16 times that at about $110,000. So while China's economy is certainly much larger, it looks like each individual citizen on average is better off in Luxembourg. Financially speaking, that is.
We haven't really talked about why some countries have a high GDP and others have a low GDP. So why are some countries rich and others poor?
The main reason some countries are rich is because of their productivity, their ability to produce more output per worker
per hour. US workers altogether earn 18 times more per hour than Bangladeshi workers because they're able to produce 18 times more output per hour. US workers today earn 8 times more per hour than US workers 100 years ago because they produce 8 times more output per hour. But not only is the US producing more stuff, it's also producing higher value products.
Limitations aside, low productivity remains a fundamental reason why some countries are poor. Higher productivity not only helps explain why we have more money to buy stuff, but also why we have more stuff to buy. So if you want a single one-word answer as to why some countries are more successful than others, here it is: productivity. So if you look at the big picture,
And by big picture, we mean both globally and historically.
increasing productivity has resulted in increased standards of living for much of humanity over the last 100 years.
UMass Lowell cultivates startup companies, conducts groundbreaking research, and trains highly skilled workers. This is the fuel needed to power the Massachusetts economy.
The Commonwealth needs a pretty interesting, diversified workforce in order to stay at the forefront of the nation's economy and the world's economy. UMass Lowell actually plays a really interesting role in depicting who these students are. You need problem solvers, makers, and thinkers all in the same person.
To build the workforce the Commonwealth needs, UMass Lowell has formed stronger partnerships with companies to expand co-op and internship programs.
In 1971, history is made. Here under the sea, we discover the treasure of all treasures, the North Field. As you see, the discovery of gas literally transformed our country overnight. Today, Qatar's exploration and production of oil and natural gas makes us one of the most important energy suppliers in the world.
Mauritius is now more than just paradise for holidaymakers. It's an economic success story. The government provides free education right up until tertiary level and free health services for all. A must, it seems, for any developing country that's determined to improve its lot. Critics warn, though, that it is becoming something of a tax haven, a suggestion fiercely denied by authorities.
Mauritius has no natural resources, geographically an isolated island, and yet here it is managing to grow, managing to provide basic public goods to all the population. Just give us a sense of how Mauritius did it.
Well, it's never been a miracle. It's hard work. It's pragmatic approach to development. Yeah. We have never been ideological about development. We've been very pragmatic. And maybe precisely because we have nothing, except the most important resource, people, that we went the way we went.
there are basically three factors that determine whether a country will be rich or poor. The first is institutions. Institutions are beyond important. Broadly speaking, rich countries have good institutions, and poor ones have very, very bad ones. The correlation between poverty and corruption is direct. The richest countries in the world are quite simply invariably also the least corrupt ones. And the most corrupt countries are also the poorest. Without an adequate tax base, poor countries can't invest in police, education, health, and transport.
Capitalism means learning how to own and control the land, the business, and the resources, and use other people's labor to enrich yourself and your community. That's capitalism. You want me to repeat that for you again? I want to make sure your listeners understand what it is. Capitalism means learning how to own and control the land, resources, and businesses, and use other people's labor to enrich yourself. That's why slavery worked so effectively. That's capitalism. That's in the 1500s.
So capitalism is an economic system, but it's also a cultural system. It's characterized by innovation and investment to increase wealth. So let's say it's 1200 CE and you're a rug merchant. Just like merchants today, you sometimes need to borrow money in order to buy the rugs you want to resell at a profit, and then you pay that money back, often with interest, once you've resold the rugs. But it only affected a sliver of the population, and it didn't create a culture of capitalism. Another factor was a remarkable increase in agricultural productivity in the 16th century. As food prices started to rise, it became profitable for farmers, both large and small, to invest in agricultural technologies that would improve crop yields. This increased productivity eventually brought down prices, and this encouraged further innovation in order to increase yield to make up for the drop in prices. Lower food prices had an added benefit. Since food cost less and wages in England remained high, workers would have more disposable income, which meant that if there were consumer goods available, they would be consumed, which incentivized people to make consumer goods more efficiently and therefore more cheaply.
(1670), Delft, Dutch Republic. The newly independent Dutch Republic is the world's first explicitly capitalist nation, where lazy aristocrats are looked down upon and hard-working merchants revered. In the churches, Protestant sermons about thrift and hard work are heard.
Mercantilism is an economic system that was used by European countries in the 15 to 1700s. Under mercantilism, a country's wealth was determined by its accumulation of gold and silver. So just about everything the government did was to make sure it gained more gold and more silver. In order to get this gold and silver, a country needed a favorable balance of trade. This means that the country exports more than it imports.
Here's another system of trade that you need to understand as part of this process of mercantilism, and it's known as triangular trade. Okay, and what we'll see is that Europeans transported manufactured goods to the west coast of Africa. Okay, and then what they do is the traders exchange these goods for captured Africans, who were then sold in the Americas. So they would trade the goods for captured Africans, who were then turned into slaves, and those slaves and gold, if they paid gold for those manufactured goods, would then be shipped to either South America, the Caribbean region, or even into North America itself. And then the merchants that bought that sugar, coffee, and tobacco in the West Indies would then sail back to Europe to sell these products.
Just in between, show you what they were doing, just from 1500 to 1660 as an example, they shipped 5 million black folk out of Africa just to Central America down here. to dig for gold and silver. Black folk at that point in time were producing almost 99% of all the sugar on earth, cotton, tobacco, anything else. They were building all the houses. They were the caulkers, builders. So what they did then, they started advertising in Europe. So anybody who wants to get wealth, they go to America. You go to America, we guarantee you. We give you free land and free labor. And you would have to be an idiot to come to America if we give you free land and free labor and not get rich. Black people in the South, on the eve of Civil War, picked and sold alone over 1 billion pounds of cotton and was sold just to England alone. England paid 48 cents a pound for that cotton. That cotton, that money from that cotton, gave every white person in the United States $500 without even working on the eve of the Civil War. So what I'm telling you is that they didn't get their wealth from working hard.
Capitalism began as a result of developments in technology, especially steam power. Cities were exploding in size, vast companies were forming, a new managerial elite was replacing the old aristocracy.
Capitalism is also a cultural system rooted in the need of private investors to turn a profit. So the real change needed here was a change of mind. People had to develop the capitalist values of taking risks and appreciating innovation. Industrial capitalism developed first in Britain in the 19th century. Britain had a bunch of advantages. It was the dominant power on the seas, and it was making good money off of trade with its colonies, including the slave trade. Also, the most important idea that was popularized in England was that men and women were consumers as well as producers, and that this was actually a good thing because the desire to consume manufactured goods could spur economic growth. So this increased productivity also meant that fewer people needed to work in agriculture in order to feed the population. To put this in perspective, in 1520, 80% of the English population worked the land. By 1800, only 36% of adult male laborers were working in agriculture, and by 1850, that percentage had dropped to 25. This meant that when the factories started humming, there were plenty of workers to hum along with them.
1854, London. The British economy is now the largest in the world, thanks to its enormous industries of cotton, shipbuilding, steel and coal. Vast cities have chewed up the countryside of the Midlands and northern England. Merchants and the newly rich capitalist class have triumphed.
Over the course of the century, you had a couple of things happen. You had, first, education open up dramatically, so that you had larger and larger portions going to college. But not only that, you had a new kind of stratification of how kids went to college. So that Harvard, which used to be a school which had a lot of rich kids and a fair number of smart ones, became a school where you had a lot of smart kids and a fair number of rich ones. And the same thing was going on throughout the education system.
Imagine being kidnapped or sold into captivity, forced into submission through violent beatings, torture, and intimidation, sold on the auction block to the highest bidder, and being forced to work for free under the most cruel, deplorable conditions, and it's all perfectly legal. This was the existence for blacks enduring the horrific institution of enslavement in our nation's early years.
When indentured servitude was changed into the permanent state of slavery, permanent state of the institution of slavery, the Virginia colonists passed a series of laws that are called the slave codes. And these slave codes are codified into law to restrict and prohibit enslaved people from having access to government, from having access to private enterprise, as well as prohibiting enslaved people from having relationship between wife to husband, husband to children, and subsequently the ownership of property.
With the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, slavery was abolished and African Americans were given the right to vote. Despite the progress, newly freed blacks faced an array of daunting social obstacles. To deal with these issues, the Union began an era known as Reconstruction. During Reconstruction, former slaves were given the right to vote, and as a result, the nation's first black senators were elected.
In the period of 1867 to 1871, this is a period right after the Civil War and before D.C. became a territory, before Congress instituted territorial government in D.C. You have some drastic changes in the city, and it all starts with African Americans petitioning for the right to vote.
People in that time were Republicans by and large. You know, I mean, there's people don't realize that now. Up until the era of FDR, you know, but black people were mostly Republicans because we were paying a debt to Abraham Lincoln because of the Emancipation Proclamation, and we still basically supported the Republican Party.
But the advances would not continue. With the controversial election of 1876 and the Jim Crow laws that followed, much of the historic gains during Reconstruction would evaporate.
In 1883, the Supreme Court made a fateful decision. They voted to nullify the Civil Rights Act of 1875. That meant that from now on, there could once again be whites-only hotels, restaurants, barbershops, and theaters. Black leader Henry McNeil Turner knew he had been betrayed by the nation's highest court.
Entrepreneurship is the best game in the world if you understand the system that we live under, the structure. If you understand the framework of the country that you live in. For example, I live in the United States. The framework that our system was built upon is called capitalism. Now, schools don't teach this. They don't teach capitalism. You know why? Because schools, they train employees to go work for corporations, and they're funded by corporations and the government. So those employees can be exploited at some point. So the government wants you to be rich. They want you to become successful, and the rules are made to benefit the entrepreneur. And if you understand the tip I just gave you, you will become an entrepreneur.
Industry, business, capitalism. These are universal truths about our American culture. That's how our modern economy was built. In the early 20th century, segregation created an entirely separate economy complete with successful African-American entrepreneurs. In Richmond, Virginia, young Maggie Walker was about to become a big part of that economy. This Richmond woman was born into poverty, but valued education, her faith, and hard work above anything else. In 1903, she founded the St. Luke Penny Bank, leading the organization profitably and lifting her community. She also ensured the bank would last for generations by merging with another bank to become Consolidated Bank and Trust.
She urged African Americans to start their own businesses, and one of the ways in which she implemented that was starting that bank, the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank, and in that way she was able to provide loans to African Americans so that they could acquire property and start their own businesses, and she saw through to the end that what she was preaching, this African American sustainability, was actually working.
Opportunity for black businesses is the driving force behind the 7 decades of the Houston Citizens Chamber's existence.
We were founded in 1935, and C.F. Richardson was a publisher, L.H. Spivey was a printer, H.P. Carter was a community activist out in the Fifth Ward area.
Those names belong to the men who got together back in 1935 to create an organization very similar to the all-white Houston Chamber of Commerce. This was a Houston in the grip of the Depression and where segregation was a way of life.
Where the downtown is today was a growing business community of African Americans, but yet they had to do it amongst trials, tribulations, and tumultuous times.
We couldn't go into certain stores. So we had to have our own grocery stores. They didn't want to do our cleaning of our clothes, so we had to have our own cleaners there. They didn't want us eating in their food establishments, so we had to have our own food cafes, restaurants there to supply us with cooked food there. In any area that you can think of that you need for your livelihood, we had to operate a business to support us because no one wanted to take any of our business at that time. You had to deal with each other.
So the Houston Negro Chamber of Commerce was born in the Pilgrim Building on West Dallas near Bagby, the heart of black commerce in the Fourth Ward.
Mr. J.E. Robinson was the first president.
The founders realized organizing was the key to not just black economic growth, but daily survival. In those early days, the vision was large, but the knowledge limited. The Negro Chamber extended its services to every black neighborhood in the city in an effort to help people realize their own economic strengths, despite the challenges of segregation.
We were able to create some excitement, because just the idea of the talk in the community about our getting together, and getting together is not easy.
The Negro Chamber activities provided an atmosphere for the determined and dedicated business owner to thrive. A young couple from Chicago arrived in Houston in 1935 and chose the Pilgrim Building to house their 20-year-old family business, the Franklin Beauty School. James Jemison and his bride, Abby Franklin Jemison, opened a beauty college complete with dormitories. As hair care was the 5th largest industry in America at the time, the Franklin Beauty School attracted students from all over the country. The Jemisons built a business, a fortune, and helped change a community. This was a time when a man named Mac Hanna rose to prominence in business. Hanna was a multimillionaire who owned a life insurance company in 3rd Ward, founded a mortgage company and a savings and loan.
Arthur George Gaston was born in a log cabin built by his grandparents after they were freed from slavery. He eventually built a business of providing services often denied to African Americans during the years of segregation. When he died in 1996 at the age of 103, Mr. Gaston was worth over $130 million.
I was 21 years old when Uncle Arthur died, and by then some of the more tangible of his accomplishments had been impressed upon me. Walking around downtown Birmingham, it was impossible not to notice his name clinging in bold letters to the side of so many buildings. Impossible not to recognize that it was not just the members of my family who deferred to him, but people all over the city. I learned that he had built businesses and that he owned a bank, that he had known Martin Luther King Jr. and had shaken President Kennedy's hand more than once. Though his climb up from the bottom of society was never discussed per se, I began to understand why Uncle Arthur's expectations of us were always so high. Sometimes it seemed impossibly so. There were no excuses in his house or when he was in yours. He and Auntie both made it clear that excellence was the only option. And though their methods could have had precisely the opposite effect, the fact of the matter was that you wanted to be better when you were around them. They made you want to measure up. None of this was accomplished with threats or rewards. It was simply the case that you looked at Uncle Arthur and knew, just knew, that this was a man who had done something big, and it made you want to be big someday too.
Back to those early days, my own early days in high school, junior high school, there was no division really between lower class blacks and middle class blacks. Lower class blacks looked up to middle class blacks, but they wanted to be just like them. The best example is how much respect blacks had for education and black teachers. Any teacher walking down any street in the South could say anything to any black student, and they was like their mother had spoken to them. So that was high respect for black teachers, and of course, a number of blacks were making a lot of money. I mean, segregation was good for entrepreneurs because, number one, white funeral homes didn't bury blacks. White barbers didn't cut black hair. Okay? So blacks controlled the taxi industry, going through. So, and what I'm really trying to do is remind blacks of the values we once had that we don't have today.
Back on Fayetteville Street again, we are reminded that Hayti is almost completely self-sufficient in her shopping facilities. Hayti is almost completely self-sufficient in her shopping facilities. You will find many beautiful homes in Hayti, from the large, pretentious ones on beautiful shaded lawns to the smaller, neat bungalows. There vibrates a wholesome substantiality which gives this community a fine dignity. Many Hayti merchants have outside interests as well as their own businesses. The Baldwin Farm reflects one of them. Here, the ownership of fine horses and hundreds of acres of rich farmland once more establish Negro Durham's substantiality. The Durham Business and Professional Chain, composing a far-sighted group of business and professional men, is keenly interested in the welfare, progress, and improvement of this community. They work diligently for better living conditions, a higher standard of living, increased educational facilities, and a greater school enrollment.
Harvard economist Richard Freeman noted, "The triumph of globalization and market capitalism has improved living standards for billions, while concentrating billions among the few." So it's kind of a mixed bag. The very poor are doing a little better, but the very rich are now a lot richer than everybody else.
Capitalism is amazingly productive, but it has two big flaws. Firstly, it's systematically inclined to ignore the sufferings of workers unless regularly prodded not to. And the wealth of companies is often built up on satisfying what are not the essential needs of human beings.
Although he's often considered the father of communism because he co-wrote the Communist Manifesto, Marx was above all a philosopher and a historian. It's just that unlike most philosophers and historians, he advocated for revolution. His greatest work, Das Kapital, sets out to explain the world of the 19th century in historical and philosophical terms. So Marx was writing in 19th century England, and there were two classes that mattered: the workers and the capitalists. The capitalists owned most of the factors of production, in this case, land and the capital to invest in factories. The workers just had their labor. So the class struggle here is between capitalists who want labor at the lowest possible price and the workers who want to be paid as much as possible for their work.
Charles Dickens, one of Victorian England's most passionate critics of unrestrained capitalism, publishes a novel, Hard Times. Set in the fictional town of Coketown, a version of Manchester, it takes aim at heartless capitalists like Mr. Gradgrind, who abuse their workers, exploit young children in mines and chimneys, and use their relentless capitalist logic to blind them to their desecration of nature and human life. Dickens argues that capitalism is evil because it encourages appalling conditions for the producers. Under the sway of capitalist logic, otherwise quite nice people will keep coming up with reasons why it's okay to employ a child in a factory or to let poor people starve once they've reached the end of their working lives.
This man, Mao Zedong, brought a country of 540 million peasant people into the modern world. He did it after half a century of war and civil war. He used a mixture of nationalism and communism to bind the people together. He led the Chinese Communist Party for 42 years.
The most common form of communism comes from the work of German philosophers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, in what is today known as Marxism. In particular, Marxism is focused on the exploitation of the worker. It's based on the idea that any profit generated by the worker but instead goes to the business owner is a form of inequality and should be abolished. In recent history, several countries, including the USSR, China, Vietnam, and Cuba, have attempted to institute their own versions of communism. Unfortunately, attempts to achieve this political philosophy have led to lower standards of living, government corruption, and in the case of the USSR, total collapse and failure. A number of reasons have been put forth as to why communism hasn't worked out historically. But the strongest criticism of the philosophy is that communism removes the incentive for people to work harder than they absolutely have to. It also leads to resentment of those who work less hard but receive the same. In general, communism is described as being great in theory while disastrous in practice. Marxism-Leninism prioritizes the infallibility of its dictatorship government. The rationale is that any benefit to the state would also be a benefit for the people. However, in practice, this has meant that the ruling party can massively depreciate the population's standard of living for the good of the state. What do Scandinavia, Bernie Sanders, and the Soviet Union have in common? Well, arguably the most misused theory of all time, socialism. A social democracy generally prioritizes improving quality of life through equal rights and opportunities, bolstered by a state-run welfare system and on top of a capitalist economy. In the U.S.'s capitalist society, high-quality education is expensive, meaning that those who can afford it are generally given better opportunities. Those who can't are forced to compete at a material disadvantage. This leads to class inequality, not on the basis of talent or ability, but on generational wealth. In countries like Finland, where high-quality education is free, everyone is given the same opportunity to succeed or fail, regardless of their financial status. If that sounds a bit idealistic, that's because it's supposed to. Early socialism was predicated on the idea that if we could eliminate classes and have true societal equality, it would be a utopia.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. 5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
Philosophy professor Angela Davis admitted that she is a member of the Communist Party.
Hoover put her on the top 10. Everybody had a file on her.
Her first lecture drew 2,000 students.
Angela's education is now being put into practice.
Angela Davis purchased 4 guns.
There is a conspiracy in the land. It's a conspiracy to wipe out the black community as a whole.
Racism is an excuse used for capitalism, and we know that racism is just it's a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people, and we're going to have to put it back in the hands of the people.
Mr. Fred Halstead and Mr. Paul Boutel are running respectively for President and Vice President of the United States on the Socialist Workers' Party ticket. Mr. Halstead is by profession a cloth cutter. He has been active all of his life in the trade union movement and active as a participant in the socialist newspaper, The Militant. Mr. Paul Boutel is by profession a taxi cab driver and ran a while ago for Attorney General for the state of New York, but was defeated.
And I read somewhere that you said that if, in fact, the black people acquired capitalism and accepted white values, then you would think that that was counterproductive. Can you explain to me what you meant by that?
Black people, under the general heading of capitalism, have experienced slavery and all the other shades of degradation between slavery and actual chattel slavery and where we are now. So there's a basic reaction to the word capitalism by people who feel trapped at the bottom of the economy. So when we talk about self-development, self-determination in the black community, there's a rather positive taste left in people's mouths. When one talk about capitalism, people say we don't want to deal with the system that has suppressed folks and us out. So we tend not to use the terminology.
The Houston Negro Chamber of the 1960s promoted its agenda during a very tumultuous time nationwide. The fight for justice led to urban violence that claimed some black businesses as victims.
This was in the middle of, arguably even at the zenith of black power. In the midst of all this black power, we got blacks breaking in black folks' stores. Now, you know, obviously that dog will not hunt. To my dad's credit, he never allowed that to discourage him. And the African American community was very kind towards my dad in terms of, you know, granting him patronage. But wouldn't it be a lot better if we didn't, you know, steal from one another or discourage one another?
Rising crime in historically black neighborhoods and the intoxicating feeling of freedom as Jim Crow crumbled led to widespread relocation of African Americans to the suburbs, a flight that eventually decimated the bustling black commerce centers of West Dallas, Lyons, and Dowling streets, and left the community figuring out how to rebuild itself economically.
And we became a desegregated or integrated community, we lost a little snap, if you would. Now, I'm not saying let's go back to segregated days, but I'm saying that America and Houston would be better places to live if we as African Americans had brought some of that same, what shall we say, collaboration, coordination, collaboration, coordination, and collaboration to the table, and that same sense of pride.
Negro customers can no longer be pigeonholed. They cannot be classified as prospects who trade only in certain stores, certain neighborhoods. Today, Negroes shop downtown. They shop in supermarkets. They shop in small neighborhood stores. They'll buy from anyone who wants to sell to them. But we all know that before you can sell to customers, you've got to get to know them.
The secret of selling to the Negro is expressed in one word. That word is recognition. Now, there's nothing unusual about that. People want to be recognized. They need recognition. That's basic in all of us. But perhaps because he's had so little of it, the Negro needs even more. He needs to feel important and appreciated. For a long time, the Negro has been sold a lot of shoddy, second-class merchandise. So now he asks for name brands in order to make sure he gets his money's worth. Buying by brand, that's the first important Negro buying habit.
Former Michigan City man Richard Hatcher became one of the first two black mayors ever elected in major cities. He and Carl Stokes of Cleveland were elected the same day. And the next New Year's Day, Hatcher took over, held his first official news conference announcing his cabinet.
And I will faithfully discharge.
And I will faithfully discharge
the duties of the office of mayor.
The duties of the office of mayor.
In and for the city of Los Angeles.
In and for the city of Los Angeles.
According to the best of my ability.
According to the best of my ability.
So help me God.
So help me God.
In October 1973, Atlanta made history. Maynard Jackson was elected the first black mayor of a large southern city.
Never, never shall I let you down.
By a narrow margin, Carl Stokes had been elected mayor of America's 10th largest city.
Those of us who were Polish, Hungarian, Negroes, Germans, Irish, all Jewish, yeah. Yes, Jewish.
They protected their own.
Stop pushing poison in the neighborhood.
Panthers, y'all worse than the police. They fought for respect.
You brutalize our community, we will defend ourselves.
They demanded justice.
We're not anti-white, we're anti-oppression.
They were the soul.
We're seizing the time.
Behind the struggle.
Power to the people.
Rated R.
I mean, if this is truly a melting pot in the country where we care about it, and Lady Liberty got a hand like this, she really loves us, then we really need to be like that. And it needs to be the black kids. If there's a white person who got money, then he need to help them. He need to help black kids, Mexican kids, Korean kids, whatever. But it need to be real. And it need to be before we all die, and then you say, oh, I made a mistake. We should have gave them some money. We really should have helped these folks. It's going to be too late.
Hi, I'm Senator Bernie Sanders speaking to you from the great city of New York with a Hollywood Reporter and my fellow Brooklynite, Spike Lee, and we're going to talk about how we transform our country.
When they started the purge against communism in this country and against the voice of those who saw hope in a design for socialist theory and for the sharing of wealth and for the equality of humankind, when we abandon our vision and vigils on that topic, I think we sold out ourselves.
Let's talk about your relationship with Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. You seem to have a different opinion of him than many folks in America do. You've praised him time and again. I believe you have had a meeting with him back in 2006. What about Chavez appeals to you?
Well, first of all, I consider the President Hugo Chavez my friend.
And I still hear everybody skirt right past, once again, the biggest issue is addressing white supremacy in a capitalist society that is built on someone being capitalized upon.
Capitalism needed racism in order to operate. To explain further, capitalism needed to steal things in order to come into fruition. The racist culture that we have is necessitated by capitalism. We won't get rid of that racist culture until we get rid of capitalism.
I believe a lot of this goes back to when black Americans accepted this liberal premise that we're not accountable for anything. You know, we wait for our welfare checks. We wait for it like, you know, people wait for it like, I'm waiting for my check, like it's something I worked for, you know, and it's taken away everything, everything that God gave us innately, that you know, man, if you put two people on an island with nothing, innately they're going to have a certain desire to survive, to thrive, to do better. All of that's suppressed in our community.
I think it's very unfair, and I think it's very stupid. I mean, it doesn't make sense.
Ebony Boost, who has 3 children and is currently on welfare, just learned about the state's new policy that will take effect October 1st. If your child is truant, missing more than 10 days of school, your family's welfare cash benefits will be cut off. Threatening to take away state aid is expected to make parents more responsible.
It was the most memorable time of my life. It was a touching moment because I never thought this day would ever happen. I won't have to worry about putting gas in my car. I won't have to worry about paying my mortgage. You know, if I help him, he's gonna help me.
You got Obama phone?
Yes, everybody in Cleveland, low minority, got Obama phone. Keep Obama in president, you know. He gave us a phone.
He gave you a
gonna
phone.
Do more.
In my case, they done been in my life 6 months and I'm homeless.
37-year-old Angel Adams blames the system for her problems. We called the Department of Children and Families to see what they've been doing to help. DCF says Hillsborough Kids Incorporated has been helping by paying Adams rent, even providing her furniture. Adams says it isn't enough.
Somebody needs to pay for all my children, and mine and Gary, all our suffering, all our pain. Somebody needs to be held accountable, and they need to pay.
I'm Professor Walter Williams at George Mason University, Fairfax, Virginia. The illegitimacy is entirely new, as well as the high unemployment among blacks is entirely new. So one has to ask, well, what is the cause? I think that the cause is the welfare state. It's less costly for the girl to have a baby out of wedlock. Then the social stigma associated with illegitimacy has virtually vanished. You know, years ago when I was a kid, if a girl made a mistake, and it was very rare, relatively rare, even in North Philadelphia, if a girl made a mistake, she was an embarrassment to her family. And very often she was sent down south to live with her relatives while she was pregnant. Today, it's entirely different. Your girls have babies out of wedlock, and then they have baby showers and things like this. They celebrate. There's no more social stigma associated with it. And so what we've been doing, I think, as a nation, we've been subsidizing irresponsible behavior.
If we wanted to be serious about evidence, we might compare where blacks stood 100 years after the end of slavery with where they stood after 30 years of the liberal welfare state.
Yes.
Explain that.
Well, in 1960, which would be almost 100 years after the end of slavery, 22% of black kids grew up in homes with only one parent.
Just 22%?
Yes.
4 out of 5 were in homes with both parents?
Yes. 30 years later, after the liberal welfare state, that number had more than tripled. And so you can run through a whole bunch of other things like that. Look at the housing projects. The housing projects in the first half of the 20th century, during that first 100 years after slavery, did not have the high crime rates, the murder rates, the graffiti, all the rest of it. We associate. None of that was there. On Saturday mornings, it was common in the housing project of this earlier era for parents to leave their doors unlocked because some of the parents could afford television, some couldn't. So the ones who had television would leave their doors unlocked, and the kids from the other families could come down there and watch television with them. Well, now, the latest figures show that most people below the poverty line have 2 television sets and cable, but they wouldn't dare leave their doors unlocked in a public housing project.
The families were intact and schools worked and the neighborhoods were more or less safe. People were able to lead decent lives. If the contrast between that world and the world we inhabit now is owing so directly to liberal policies intended, so we're told, to help African Americans, why do African Americans support the liberal at the rates of 90% and more?
And you young people here today, you don't know it, but I'm telling you, black folk had viable, competitive communities before integration. They had clean communities. We did not have the crime in the black communities. As a matter of fact, before integration, most blacks in America never had to lock their doors.
And I always say that these blacks in those days, even during segregation, did more and built more than we can even maintain today.
What are the 5 biggest issues facing blacks in America? Here's my list. Problem number 5, the victim mentality. Nothing holds someone back more than seeing himself as a victim. Why? Because the victim is not responsible for his situation. Everything is someone else's fault. And the victim sees little chance of improving his life. How can he get ahead if someone is holding him back? All this makes the victim unhappy, frustrated, and angry. This is how too many blacks see themselves, as victims. So much so that their victim status becomes their primary identity and their ruling ideology. I call it victimology. Unfortunately, many black churches preach this victimology. Many black parents pass it on to their children, inner city schools teach it to their students, and the black media reinforce it. Meanwhile, the NAACP and other black grievance groups fundraise on it.
Because we're descendants from slaves, that, you know what, it's okay, it's not your fault. You're a victim, it's okay. And they've created this sort of pull, you know, it's not just a physical ghetto I'm talking about, but a mental sort of barrier.
Today's conversation is really about, as I said earlier, an African-American agenda.
How do we deal with the disparities? How do people even get into the situation we're in? What's happening in their environments that's leading to asthma and obesity and heart disease?
We acknowledge that anytime you talk about black folk in America, you're talking about a state of emergency, especially for black poor and working people. So that when you talk about love, you're making it a priority to say, America, keep track of the prison-industrial complex, keep track of the dilapidated housing, keep track of the disgraceful school systems, keep track of the unemployment rates and underemployment rates and unavailable health care, child care. That is what it means to talk about a black agenda.
Our pain today, even as we deal with the health care challenge, and it is a real challenge, that in Chicago, 3,200 black Americans die a year from health disparity. More die a year in this city from health care disparity than in the 9/11 terrorist attack 10 years ago. Obviously, those in the most pain must have some priority attention.
Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. Today on the show, a conversation about capitalism and white supremacy with two brilliant minds, Dr. Cornel West and Professor Rick Wolff. Welcome you both to the program. I'm so glad to have you here.
Blessed to be here.
You've been revisiting old masters. I know because we did a panel together about Tom Paine. You're doing another panel with Gail Dines and Chris Hedges. Cornell can't make it, but we're talking about Marx. But Marx was a German writing about industrialism in 19th century Northern Europe. Is that relevant to people here in the States in the 21st century, especially African American people?
I think it's very relevant. Karl Marx was one of the great prophetic figures of the 19th century because he had an analysis of capitalism that kept track of the precious humanity of working people and poor people. No one can deny under global capitalism that there's been an escalation of oligarchs, of plutocrats. No one can deny that big banks and big corporations do not dominate government. No one can deny that working people are not benefiting to the degree to which hedge fund folk are, Wall Street people are, so that wealth inequality and all that goes with it has to be, one has to come to terms with it. So in that sense, Marxist analysis is probably the most indispensable form of analysis to make sense of a highly financialized monopoly capitalism in our day.
It was the middle of the 1970s. Police repression and personal quarrels had broken the spirit of the Black Panthers. The militants were going home. Everyone was trying to find their place in society, a society where they may have been electing the first black mayors, but where for most American blacks, recession was ravaging the big cities and destroying communities. Among the leaders of the civil rights movement, the energy of soul power had given way to bitterness.
Baltimore is the worst place in America for a black male to grow up and live. We're living under third world conditions.
It's a very segregated by race and class city.
When it comes to unemployment and access to resources, it's easy to go crazy here. People are suffering here in West Baltimore, and they're being ignored, even from people who live a half a mile from them, because Baltimore is a very segregated city. You could literally walk across the street and be in a different tax bracket.
This is America's ghost town, just 25 miles from downtown Chicago. Gary, Indiana, dubbed a symbol of urban blight by some, compared to post-evacuation Chernobyl by others. Gary's population has been cut by half as many fled in search of work. It is now almost exclusively African American, over 84%. Up to 1/3 are poor in one of the top 10 most dangerous cities in America.
Camden, New Jersey. Camden has been on Forbes' list of America's most miserable cities for years. Riddled with urban decay and political corruption, over 42% of its residents live below the poverty line. It also has 560% more crime than the national average.
With the rapid growth of Charlotte comes a hidden problem: kids in poverty.
We can't go and parade and look at it, but it's actually everywhere.
A new study by the Annie E. Casey Foundation found those numbers are growing in North Carolina. It estimates more than 500,000 children in the state are living in poverty.
That's not in California, that's not in New York City, that is in Charlotte, North Carolina, the city that we deem our Queen City.
In Detroit, blacks aren't just the majority, they're the authority. They run the police, the courts, the schools, and City Hall. But black political power hasn't meant black economic prosperity.
In my time in Detroit, I have driven and walked past mile after mile of decayed, rotting neighborhoods that look like war zones, burned out buildings, crack houses.
If you've been coming in any length of time, those were there when I became mayor. And a whole lot of that's been restored.
Look at cities like Detroit, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. They've been run by progressive Democrats for decades. If their liberal policies were at all effective, these cities should have become models of economic growth and prosperity. Instead, they're models of dysfunction. By fostering and exploiting the victim mentality, discouraging self-examination, subsidizing baby mamas, and making excuses for black thugs, so-called progressive policies don't alleviate the problems that afflict the black community. They aggravate those problems. Unwavering loyalty to progressive liberal policies is the primary reason these dire conditions persist. It both makes them possible and perpetuates them. It's no coincidence that progressivism is the common thread that binds predominantly black cities where single-parent homes, failing schools, rampant poverty, and crime predominate.
If we look back over history, when the Congress was controlled by the Democrats for 40 consecutive years, if we look at the control what has happened in black America, we saw greater poverty. If we take the statistics from 1970s to the 21st century, what we see very clearly is that poverty has gone from 11% to 15%. These are classic examples that the policies of the left have not worked.
I lived in Philadelphia for a while, and it's a great city, a really, truly great city. But it is a city that has enslaved itself with socialism and corruption like I haven't seen. Why is it, sir, that some of our Washington, D.C., Detroit, Philadelphia, our biggest cities are enslaving themselves?
Well, most of the inner cities are run by black liberal Democrats. The mayor, for the most part, are black. The police chiefs are black. City council men and women are black. And yet, the cities are out of control. Black-on-black crime out of control. 70% of black babies born out of wedlock nationwide. And in the state of Indiana, 80% of black babies are born out of wedlock. And it is because of socialism. Most black Americans, not all, but most black Americans have a socialist mentality. And one of the big mistakes that black Americans made was to elect politicians, especially liberal politicians, thinking that it was going to enhance their lives. They thought that if they had black Democrats in control of the city, somehow or another, the black life would get better.
The brilliance of the American economy happens through business ownership and entrepreneurial spirit. So whether you own the business or not, success is possible if you A, have a good education, B, have a strong work ethic. For the average person who can work, these two key components come together and form a foundation. That is the way to eradicate poverty. All the social programs that we've had, we have the largest government we've ever had in the history of the country. We have more nonprofit organizations working on the same issue, and yet we have higher percentage of people living in poverty.
W.B. Du Bois says capitalism is like having 4 years of corn. You eat, save, and sell, and use the seeds for next year's planting. That's capitalism. Where in there, where you see blacks selling, producing, okay, and using seeds for next year's harvest? Do you see me in either one of those definitions? I mentioned anything about social integration? Did I mention anything about civil rights?
We've spent most of our lives focusing politically on things that are non-inheritable. See, when the civil rights movement started, you talk about your integration years. Is you a product of an integrated generation? What did your generation focus on? You focused on welfare, food stamp, public housing, okay, civil rights, social integration, preferential treatment, getting a job. How do you inherit those things? What is there to inherit?
So politics is not going to solve all our problems. Tell the folks at home that.
Politics
Professor Gimbu
is not going to solve most of our problems. Most politics that affects people is at the local level. Most politics that affects people is at the local level.
That's right.
Local politics affects people mostly. National politics has some impact, but very, very minimal impact in regards to the quality of life of the average person.
Here it is. Here's the system, right? The United States government is funded by tax dollars. So you wrote that down? The United States government, who regulates what? The economy, is funded by tax dollars. It is not a private entity. It is a public entity. Now, the United States government, contrary to what you believe, is actually you. It's not the president. It's not Congress. It's not the House of Representatives. You understand it? It's not the lawmakers. The government is you.
What are the goals of taxation? At the most basic level, taxes raise money for government services. Taxes are used to promote the well-being of society, at least well-being as defined by the government in power. They help us afford services markets might not pay for on their own. Things like public safety and national defense and education. Taxes can be used as a way to redistribute wealth in a society, from people who have more to people who have less.
Job insurance means just what it says. As part of the Federal Social Security Act, it was backed by all parties in Congress and passed by an overwhelming majority. It was signed by President Roosevelt and became law on August 14, 1935. Throughout the land, industry and labor joined in this new attack on unemployment and insecurity.
This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
President Johnson signed a $947.5 million anti-poverty bill into law in 1964. The following year, 1965, President Johnson enacted reforms to Social Security and a guarantee of health insurance for the elderly and the poor through Medicare and Medicaid. The official poverty rate has dropped since Johnson's era, but still there are some 50 million Americans, 13 million of them children, living below the federal poverty line.
Fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
In 1968, President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act. For the first time, racial language was removed from federal housing policy. Non-white families began moving into traditionally white communities in numbers. The Frisbees moved from Queens to suburban Roosevelt, only a few miles from Levittown.
When I moved into a neighborhood, I thought it would stay intact the way it was. On the street that I moved on when I moved there, it was predominantly white. Within 2 years, it was predominantly black.
The white population of Detroit began one of the largest migrations in U.S. history. In 1960, Detroit had almost 1.2 million white residents. By 1980, there were only 400,000. Businesses evaporated. Once thriving commercial strips like Gratiot, Grand River, and Livernois became ghost towns.
Limits to what the government can do to help beyond providing a level playing field. This is another mentality that came out of the Great Society program, where Johnson said, equality of opportunity is not enough. We need equality of results. which you're never going to find. Not here, not anywhere, not ever. But that has become the goal. And then in the absence of that, to assume something's wrong, the government isn't doing all it can, so it needs to tip the scales a little bit here or a little bit there. That's where we get into trouble, that sort of social engineering. I mean, all the job programs, all the job training programs in the world aren't going to help if a group doesn't have a work ethic.
Denmark's model offers a mix of free market capitalism with cradle-to-grave benefits, including free health care, college tuition, retirement, child care, and sick days.
Part of their success has been build globally competitive companies. Part of their success has been build globally competitive companies and sell around the world, use those resources to fund these big social welfare systems.
China is the world's second largest economy and the biggest importer. But 40 years ago, it was a poor, largely rural nation, with at least 30% of its population living in poverty. That started to change in 1978, when China launched major economic reforms. The first were agricultural. Farmers were allowed to sell their surplus crops on the open market. Success in agriculture and more open trade led to the privatization of other state-owned enterprises. In 1980, it created 4 special economic zones to encourage foreign direct investment. As the economy opened up to the outside world, companies flooded into China to build factories and take advantage of cheap labor. Stock markets in Shanghai and Shenzhen opened in 1990. Economic growth boomed the following decade, averaging 10% a year. More than 500 million people have been lifted out of poverty since China's economic reforms began. It's been called an economic miracle, and one the global economy has come to depend on.
You go into these black communities right now, we are nothing. We're 100% consumers and zero producers. We produce absolutely nothing. We produce absolutely nothing. We produce absolutely nothing.